So my main goal for today is to really take a deep dive into Islamic State Khorasan, which I'll refer to as ISK, and explore some of the factors which were really critical in helping ISK not only establish itself, but really build its organizational capacity and also build resiliency, which has allowed it to survive really challenging circumstances in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. For example, as you may all be aware, ISK has been subjected to really intense counterterrorism operations in both Afghanistan and Pakistan, yet the group remains. So it really presents a puzzle which is intriguing. And that's my goal today, to highlight some of these factors which have been really critical. Before I go any further, I would just like to say that all the views that I present today are mine alone and do not represent views of the US government, the Combating Terrorism Center, the US Military Academy, or the DoD. So with that, I will proceed. So I want to start off with a particularly active week that ISK had, where we saw 3 attacks within the span of a single week. 2 of these were in Afghanistan and 1 was in Pakistan. So the 2 in Afghanistan, one of them was an attack on Kabul University, one in a neighborhood on a educational institution. And the one in Pakistan actually targeted a mosque where the religious leader was known to have rhetoric which was really anti-Daesh or anti-ISK. Now, a few things stand out about these attacks. First of all, they are designed to be provocative, right? Because they're targeting civilians. So clearly, ISK is seeking to generate publicity about these attacks. But if you look closely, and if you've been following ISK or Islamic State in general, you'll see that these attacks bear the typical marks of Islamic State attacks. So for one, yes, they are targeting civilians. They're targeting Shiite populations, at least in one of the attacks depicted here. And finally, you see the use of suicide attacks, right, which Islamic State is known for. So collectively, these attacks give us an indication that ISK is very much alive. And also, it seems to be an organization which is really highly resolved to retain its political relevance. Now, the next slide here shows you, it gives you a broader perspective. It's a summary of all of Islamic State Khorasan's attacks between January and June 2020. And the majority of these are in Afghanistan, except for the first one listed here. And when you take this broader perspective and these attacks combined with the 3 that I just showed you, you'll notice that 80% of these attacks are against civilian targets. Now, if you have been observing ISK's behavior over the past 3, 4, 5 years, you'll see that this denotes a change in ISK's behavior. So typically, ISK, even though it has targeted civilians, it has, on average, tended to attack state targets more frequently. So what does this change in ISK's behavior mean, right? So it could be signs of a weakened organization. As I mentioned earlier, ISK has had, it's experienced a large number of CT efforts, and it's experienced significant militant losses. So it could be signs that this organization is desperate, so it's turning more towards soft targets. But it also could be because they have been unable to yield casualties in the 2 attacks that you see here, which were against state targets. So they need to create media publicity around their attacks to actually demonstrate their resiliency, their resolve, and the fact that they're still relevant. So on this slide, you'll see the roadmap for today's talk. I have to say, one of the projects in here which focuses on CT efforts against ISK was done with my co-author, Andrew Mines, who's been a significant contributor to this part of the effort. Overall, I do want to start off by just generally revisiting what Islamic State Khorasan's goals are and what its overall strategy has been when you consider Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I'm sorry if some of you are familiar with this, but it's always good to revisit the basics. I'm then going to show you a lot of summarized data, which will allow you to look at the broader trends of ISK over the past 5 years. And then I'm going to present to you my argument, what I think is a critical source of ISK's strength, primarily its network across the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. And finally, to fully understand ISK's evolution and how it's changed its behavior, we really need to look at how CT efforts against the group have changed the group's behavior. So in the grander scheme of things, given all the violence that we observe in Afghanistan and Pakistan, you may ask, okay, those attacks were pretty devastating and they were horrible, but they were still only a handful, right? So why does it really matter? Why do we need to pay attention to ISK? From my perspective, I'll give you 3 reasons, which I hope you'll find as compelling as I do. So first of all, many claim Islamic State has been defeated, and while the fight against Islamic State still continues, the promising milestones that we hit are that Islamic State no longer holds significant amounts of territory in Iraq and Syria. That's definitely a plus point, but also that we got al-Baghdadi in 2019, although of course there's a new leader. The fight continues, right? So we need to make sure that we prevent Islamic State from reemerging and reconstituting itself in Iraq and Syria, but we also have to be attentive and make sure that Islamic State doesn't leverage its most prominent branches and affiliates around the world, because it's increasingly become clear that that's what Islamic State's strategy is, to continue to exert its influence and spread its ideology. So ISK has increasingly emerged as one of its most prominent groups. So if you think about it, it's a group which emerged in 2015, really became operational then. And by 2018, it was listed as one of the top deadliest groups in the world, so top 4. That's quite remarkable. As we've seen in 2020, it has continued to launch really provocative attacks, right? Some of the ones that I mentioned. And also the other interesting thing that we've increasingly seen is that ISK has featured more and more in Islamic State's propaganda. So for example, in a statement in October, ISK was specifically mentioned by the Islamic State leader, who mentioned ISK's prison break, which resulted in the release of several ISK militants. It's almost as if to encourage others to emulate ISK. In a recent piece of propaganda, which you see here, released by Al-Naba, on the left side, if you can see it, it's a little bit fuzzy, but you see in the list of killed and wounded distribution across the vilayats, you see the Khorasan Valaya as right at the top, right, with the most casualties. So this can have implications. For one, if you think about the fact that Islamic State frequently puts out a call for fighters to migrate to different places, well, ISK could be a good place to relocate for foreign fighters, right? If Islamic State Central still has funds to disperse, then if ISK stands out as a competent Valaya, then it's likely to attract some of the funds. We haven't really seen any evidence of that happening, but it's always good to be aware of the potential consequences. The second reason is it's really important to think about how ISK may change broader trends of terrorism and insurgency across the region. So not just in South Asia, but also Central Asia. We have the example of Al-Qaeda, who had significant impacts on what happened in South Asia, how Al-Qaeda created links with different groups, how it disseminated its ideology. Same with ISK, right? It has an ideology which is unique. It has very specific tactics. And specifically in the context of South Asia, the ideology and tactics that ISK brings with it can actually exacerbate sectarian violence, which is not good news for the region. Of course, ISK can trigger rivalries, and now we have the extension of the Al-Qaeda and Islamic State rivalry in South Asia and also in Kashmir, which is already a very volatile place. And in other places such as Southeast Asia, we have seen that Islamic State's presence or influence has actually increased female participation. While again, we haven't seen much of this in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where militancy tends to be, at least in terms of the active roles, dominated by men. Again, it's a potential implication of the increasing influence of Islamic State. And finally, I think ISK serves as a really great case study to really gain insights into how such militant groups operate, how they exploit local dynamics, how they change rivalries in cooperation with other groups, right? And again, it's also a really good case study to assess the effectiveness of CT efforts, right? And how local security concerns can hinder the outcome and effectiveness of CT efforts. All right, so with that, I'll jump into giving you a brief background on ISK. So really the groundwork for establishing ISK began in late 2014 when there were reports of IS representatives meeting with like-minded militants from the region in Pakistan. And soon after, in early 2015, there was a public announcement of the establishment of ISK, where there were a series of primarily leaders of the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, who pledged allegiance to al-Baghdadi. In 2016, early 2016, we saw the announcement of Islamic State creating a branch in Jammu Kashmir as an extension of the South Central Asia project. But we haven't really seen much practical activity on the ground in Jammu and Kashmir, but IS still continues to disseminate propaganda there. In 2019, and kind of surprisingly, we saw the casual announcement of Islamic State Hind and Islamic State Pakistan, Islamic State Hind being Islamic State India. And there's a lot of speculation on why Islamic State would do this, given that it's really against the notion of countries and national boundaries. There could be a few reasons for this. One could be simply to circumvent internal managerial issues. So we know that militant groups can be prone to internal disputes. So this could be just one way to avoid those. It could also be to better position these entities to exploit local dynamics, really tailor their propaganda to the local civilian populations, which can then result in more effective recruitment and operations. So what are ISK's goals and what are some of the challenges it faced when it first set foot in Pakistan and tried to establish a region in the neighborhood? So Khorasan actually denotes a historical region which includes parts of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Western China. But for our purposes, what we need to take away from here is groups like Islamic State, what they intend to do is eliminate national boundaries and merge all these countries into one caliphate, right? And Islamic State sees itself as the exclusive, legitimate leader of the Ummah, and they adopt a deeply Takfiri ideology. Again, this will be familiar to you if you follow Islamic State at all, where any Muslims who do not subscribe to the extreme version or interpretation of Islamic State's version of Islam, they become a legitimate target. Now, of course, the creation of a transnational caliphate does seem a little lofty, to say the least, but on the ground, even if you do not consider that goal, ISK had a lot of challenges set up against it to even begin to emerge. So first of all, it came in and began to challenge a host of multiple state actors, right? That doesn't seem like a good strategy because all those state actors then will be focused on targeting the group. But in addition to that, South Asia, Central Asia, it's known for hosting an assortment of militant groups, which all have pre-existing spheres of influence, right? They recruit from the same region, from the same pool, and they have competing ideologies and agendas. And then finally, ISK was really considered a foreign brand by many, and it still is. And many pose the question, how can Islamic State really establish a branch here when its ideology is so foreign and it doesn't really have the local know-how? So the puzzle which begins to emerge here is that despite these obstacles, how has ISK been able to not only establish itself, but thrive and then continues to survive in the region? So based on my analysis and study of the Islamic State so far, this seems to be the emergent strategy in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. So it seems that ISK has set out to establish or create space for its brand via two pathways. One is at the individual level, where it's looking to recruit from the younger population or look at defectors. But at the organizational level, its strategy seems to vary or be shaped by the general security environment in each country, but also the local militant landscape. So in Afghanistan, where ISK faces a relatively weak state and also faces a rival Afghan Taliban, it's decided to clash with the Taliban, right? Taking it on as a rival rather than creating alliances with it, while also simultaneously engaging with Afghan security forces and coalition forces. Now, on the other hand, in Pakistan, where it faces a relatively stronger state and definitely a stronger military, it also doesn't face a militant group which is comparable to the Afghan Taliban. So here what ISK appears to be doing is aligning itself with some of the region's most lethal and militant, groups which have existed in the region for years, if not decades. So these alliances with pre-existing groups in Pakistan facilitate ISK's goals in both countries, right? And they also allow pooling of resources, cross-border movement, and coordination to some extent. At the individual level, we see the same trend in both countries. ISK has tried to gain new recruits through its propaganda, and also it's quite keen to attract defectors from other organizations in both countries. So before I go any further, I want to highlight a few questions which I am asked frequently over and over again. So the first one is, as you can expect, well, how many are there in terms of militants? What's the strength of ISK? And the second question, which we get frequently, is ISK actually linked to IS Central or IS Core, or does it sort of just exist as a separate entity and only uses the brand? And finally, the question that I've been getting most recently is, okay, what does the peace deal mean for ISK, right? So I'll leave the last question for the end. Hopefully we can talk about it in the Q&A, but I do want to address the first two questions. So as you can imagine, and as it's common with militant groups, estimates of ISK strength have varied widely. In the early years, this was estimated from anywhere between 600 all the way up to 5,000, and this was from various sources. More recently in 2019, this estimate that I show here on the screen, again, is between 3,000 and 5,000, right? This is a DoD estimate. ISK claimed 20,000 fighters in October 2017, but we can ignore that for now because that just seems exaggerated, right, to say the least. From what I've seen and the rate at which ISK has been able to replenish its militant base, I think it's between 3,000 and 5,000. That figure seems correct, although ISK is so dispersed right now and militant membership in these groups is so fluid that it's really hard to pin down a definitive number. The second question is, well, is ISK really connected to IS Central? So fortunately, the Combating Terrorism Center was able to get hold of a few documents captured in Afghanistan, all unclassified, which at least in the early years helped us see that there were actually links between ISK and IS Central. So just to mention some of the themes that we were able to identify in these documents, some of them were ISK members writing to IS Central asking for more money, or seeking guidance on how to resolve an internal dispute or an issue about leadership. There was also guidance from IS Central to ISK in terms of how to edit their videos, etc. And we saw a lot of monthly reports sent from ISK to IS Central outlining what they had accomplished in a certain month, or providing justifications of why they hadn't been able to accomplish so much, mostly due to the CT operations they were facing. So clearly, at least in the early years, we can see that there has been a direct connection between IS Central and ISK. Okay, so I'll give you a warning. I'm about to show you a lot of data, but the key takeaways are just to focus on what the broader trends tell us about ISK's ability not only to set up shop, but then how it progresses in the years following its initial emergence. So this table here shows you a summary of ISK's activity in Afghanistan between 2015 and 2018. So this data is not complete all the way up till 2022, all the way up till 2020. So just to keep in mind. So as you can see, ISK's activity was spread out in several provinces, but it's pretty clear that they were primarily focused on Nangarhar and Kabul. Not surprising because we know ISK managed to gain some territorial control in the Nangarhar province, correct? So what does stand out is that despite comprising more than half of the attacks in Nangarhar, Kabul stands out as the place where you see most of IS-linked casualties, right? In the next graph here, you can see why. The green shades on this map tell you the intensity of suicide attacks. So the key takeaway from here is that in Kabul, ISK set out to, it initiated this really intense suicide attack campaign. And also Kabul is more populated, so you can expect there to be more casualties there. So the suicide attack campaign accounts for a large number of casualties in Kabul, and we are continuing to see that. You can see that in other regions, suicide attacks were pretty low. Here, I show you a summary of ISK's activity in Pakistan. Now, again, you see that there's some activity across Pakistan, but there are two main provinces, Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where you see the bulk of ISK's activity. And again, we see that in Balochistan, even though the number of attacks there are equal to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, it accounts for the bulk of casualties inflicted in Pakistan. And when you look at the map, again, the dark green shade in Balochistan shows you the intensity of suicide attacks in that province. And the similarity in the tactics are similar, that ISK chose one location in each country where it unleashed a really intense suicide attack campaign. So what does this look like temporally? So how did the attacks spread out over the years between 2015 and 2018? So this graph here is just for Afghanistan. And what you can see is that there was a steady increase, although gradual, 2015 onwards. And the most intense year was 2017. And then we see a significant drop in 2018, likely because of all the losses ISK experienced in 2016 and 2017. In Pakistan, we see that 2016 was the more active year for ISK, and then there was a decline in 2017, and it stayed pretty much low. And we see these trends continue in 2019 and 2020. I do want to draw your attention to the year 2017, where we see a decline in ISK's activity in Pakistan, but simultaneously we see an increase in Afghanistan. Now, this is possibly due to the targeted operations that the Pakistani military undertook around 2017, late 2016, which specifically targeted ISK militants along the border region. One outcome of this could be dispersion of ISK militants into Afghanistan, which led them to focus on conducting attacks in that region. Now, this is not surprising because this is something we've seen with the Pakistani Taliban as well. When due to drone strikes and due to the Pakistani military's operations along the border, a lot of the TTP militants simply escaped into Afghanistan and continued to operate from there. And there's a current concern that they may try and re-enter Pakistan. So it's not surprising if something similar has happened when it comes to ISK militants. Again, this brings in the issue of border security, especially given the 1,400-mile, very porous border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which continues to be a problem. Okay, so in this graph, I show you a comparative assessment of ISK's average lethality per attack. This allows us to assess whether ISK was improving in its ability to inflict more destructive attacks as time went on. So even though the previous graph showed you that their total number of attacks varied a lot over the years, this shows a different picture, right? So average lethality per attack every year means the total number killed and wounded every year divided by the total number of attacks in that year. And what the trends show here, that despite the fluctuation in their activity, we see a consistent increase in their average lethality per attack, right? So they're getting better at conducting more lethal attacks, which is a dangerous trend. And what we see in 2020 is that ISK retains its ability to conduct highly lethal attacks, right? And it's still relying on the use of suicide attacks. So the next thing that we did was to code the different categories in terms of who ISK was targeting. Okay, they're killing more per attack, and their attacks tend to vary over time, but who are they really going after? So we coded the data for a variety of state and civilian actors. The blue ones on the screen indicate civilian targets, and the green ones indicate state targets such as police, military, government actors, right? Afghanistan also has international armed forces and more foreign non-combatants. So the composition of the target selection of ISK seems pretty similar in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which again suggests that there is some level of coordination going on over here. What's really striking is that in both countries, the local police, unfortunately, was the most frequent target of ISK. Now, you may ask why the police in both Afghanistan and Pakistan, the police as an institution tends to be ridden with corruption. It's also a weakened institution over time. So attacking the police is easier than targeting, let's say, the military. And it also sends a strong signal to the state, right? So it's easier while also allows ISK to send a message regarding their intent and their resolve. So going back to suicide attacks for a second. So we've already kind of established that suicide attacks, at least from the 3 attacks that we saw in 2020, allow ISK to retain high lethality. And we see this trend over time. It's not isolated what we're seeing in 2020. So for just as an example, for Afghanistan, we see that the percentage of suicide attacks as a total of all attacks increased gradually, and the trend is similar in Pakistan. But in this graph, it shows very clearly why ISK is increasingly relying on suicide attacks. So the graph that you're seeing on the right here shows you that even though suicide attacks in Afghanistan made up only 32% of all types of attacks, they accounted for 66% of deaths inflicted in ISK-linked attacks. This is even more striking in the case of Pakistan. So even though suicide attacks only accounted for 22% of all attacks, they were responsible for 83% of all deaths, right? So the use of suicide attacks by ISK is not going away, given that it yields such high casualties for the group. And finally, this is, I promised, the last bit of data that I'm showing you. The last thing I did was to compare ISK's seasonal trends in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. So if you compare the top one, which is ISK's activity over the year, you see that in the first 8 months, the activity trends are almost inverse of what is happening in Pakistan, right? So for example, in March, which is a busy season for ISK militants in Afghanistan, it's not the case in Pakistan. Similarly, in May, which seems to be a busy period in Pakistan, not really the case in Afghanistan. Again, the level of coordination between ISK Afghanistan and ISK Pakistan is not really clear. But when we take all of this data together, there seems to be some sharing of resources and pooling of militants, right? And also likely cross-border movement taking place here. Okay, so that was a lot of data, but I just wanted to highlight the key takeaways, right? So we can use that data to draw a few conclusions, which is ISK has been able to build its capacity and especially its ability to kill more per every attack as time has gone on. it has focused in the past on attacking state targets, but as I mentioned in 2020, we're seeing this trend shift, right? It's still attacking minorities such as the Shia community, but perhaps it's going to now focus more on civilian targets. We're likely to see a continuation of its reliance on suicide attacks. And again, there's evidence that there may be possible coordination across the two countries. Okay, so now I'll present to you my argument of what I think is one factor which really underpins ISK's initial capacity building, but also contributes to its ongoing resilience. So in my analysis of ISK's relationships with various groups, I use two main metrics to measure or to assess relationships between these pre-existing groups and ISK. So the first metric is types of cooperation, and the second one is quality of cooperation. So I didn't invent these categories. I relied on past literature to come up with these categories to measure ISK's relationships. So the first metric just merely captures what kind of support or relationship these groups have with ISK. So in the ideological realm, it just could be a group coming out and pledging baya, right? In the logistical realm, this could be sharing of both material or non-material sources, such as weapons, training, or even just leadership consultation. The operational realm includes any interaction between groups or coordination during any stage of conducting an attack. It can also just be conducting an attack on behalf of ISK. The second metric, as I mentioned, measures the quality of cooperation, because not all cooperation is equal, right? Just as no relationships that we have are equal. So these are split into high-end cooperation and low-end. So focusing on the easier one, low-end cooperation, this is where groups were just observed to facilitate or just cooperate with ISK in one of the three domains that I just highlighted. So this could be cases where groups came out, pledged allegiance, but then we didn't really see anything from them again, or it could be just short-term tactical relationships. On the other hand, high-end cooperation includes mergers where groups have completely become absorbed by the ISK brand, or it could be where a group is interacting and facilitating ISK's activity both logistically and operationally, right? And the reason this is useful is understanding the quality of cooperation helps us predict how integrated these organizations may be with ISK and how likely their relationship is likely to last, right? Is it going to be an enduring relationship, or is it just a short-term relationship? So I'm not going to go through all of these groups, but this is just to show that we were able to identify at least 11 groups which were engaged in some sort of relationship with ISK. 7 of these 11 groups were engaged in high-end cooperation, which means either they were completely absorbed, merged with ISK, or they were cooperating with ISK in more than one domain, right? These are the relationships that we need to be attentive to because they're likely to last. 4 groups were engaged in low-end cooperation. You may ask, why do these groups have any motivations to align with ISK, and why is there so much variation? I just want to highlight that the cases where we observe strategic alliances, again, this is high-end cooperation. Of the 7 groups, we did see overlapping ideology and overlapping targets, but what was really interesting is 6 out of these 7 groups were all subjected to Pakistani military operations, right? So this could be a factor which is uniting groups with ISK. Mergers tended to be primarily TTP factions, but also groups like the IMU, which have had a real identity crisis in recent years. There's been a loss of reputation, loss of resources. So here the motivation clearly could be that merging with ISK provides them with a new reputation and possibly new sources. And low-end cooperation is where groups are only interacting with ISK for really short-term gains, and they don't really have much overlapping ideology or goals. So just to give you an example of the practical implications of ISK's relationships with these groups, especially its operational links. So the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi is a great example. It's a group which is primarily sectarian, so it targets Shiites, which is a common factor that it has with ISK. It's existed in the region since 1996. It's known to be one of Pakistan's most lethal groups. So what we saw in our data was that there were at least 5 attacks between 2016 and 2018 in Pakistan, which were linked to both ISK and Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. So there was evidence that there was some cooperation between these groups in the execution of these attacks. So collectively, these attacks resulted in 288 deaths. But if you look at the percentage, these attacks only made up 6% of ISK-linked attacks in Pakistan. However, they accounted for 40% of all deaths and injuries attributed to ISK-linked attacks in Pakistan. So what this tells you is that ISK is really dependent on its operational alliances to claim such high lethality. And given these benefits that it's able to get from these relationships, it's likely that ISK will continue to foster these relationships, because not only does it add directly to its lethality, but it also allows it to really localize the jihad that it's fighting in the region. Okay, so coming to the last part of my research, and which is great because I think we'll still have time for Q&A. So I think we can't really fully understand the evolution of ISK until we look at how CT efforts against the group have changed the nature of the group, right? And what the outcomes of these CT efforts been. So we looked at various metrics, but the two that I really want to talk about here is the first one is leadership losses. So in terms of outcomes, what do we observe in terms of leadership losses that ISK suffered in both Afghanistan and Pakistan? And finally, the big question, how did these CT efforts actually impact ISK's operational activity? The reason I focus on leadership losses is because there is a large body of literature on leadership decapitation, which shows that even though it may decentralize the group and sometimes does not completely lead to a collapse of the group, it can still significantly weaken the group. So when we collected data on this, we gathered data on all total ISK militant losses between 2015 and 2018. And we have a report out on this if you want to dive deep into ISK's losses. But we separated these into 2 subsets. One is ISK's losses in terms of rank and file members, and the other subset, which I'm focusing on now, is ISK's leadership. And by ISK's leadership, I don't just mean its emirs, I also mean its provincial level leaders, its deputies, its functional wing leaders, and also its sub-district leaders. So we created 4 different tiers, which constitute ISK's leadership collectively. And we were able to get some really interesting insights into the group through this. So overall, the leadership losses amounted to about 500 plus ISK militants. What we see here that the bulk of this is made up of tier 4 militants, which is not surprising. And they obviously are primarily located in Afghanistan, but we see a significant amount in Pakistan as well. But we see that tier 2 and 3 are primarily in Afghanistan, and tier 1, the emirs, are exclusively located in Afghanistan. Geographically, you can see how they're distributed in both countries. So again, when we look at Afghanistan, you can see the leadership losses were concentrated in Nangarhar, which was obviously the base of Islamic State Khorasan. But again, remember, Pakistan was more of a logistical hub for ISK, and so we see leadership losses spread out across Pakistan. But again, the most concentrated part, even within Pakistan, is Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, so the maroon that you see on the Pakistani map. And it's interesting, again, that Nangarhar, Kunar, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, they're all areas close to the border, which again brings into question the problem of border security and cross-border movement. So this slide here is just to show you the different targeting tactics employed by Afghan security forces, coalition forces, and really focusing in and targeting these leaders of ISK. And the years 2016 and 2017 show you how important drones have been in really targeting leaders of ISK. And of course, ground operations also became important in 2018. And we see a similar trend in Pakistan when we think back to the Pakistani Taliban, where the US drone campaign, along with Pakistani military operations on the ground, were really successful in undermining the Pakistani Taliban's leadership. Again, we see this here. And the reason I bring this up, this slide up, is because when we think about what's going to happen to ISK once the US withdraws, maybe we need to pay attention to what worked in the past, and then what happens if we take that away, right? So what was the security apparatus which really helped weaken ISK? We can see that drones and airstrikes play a pretty important role. Another really interesting finding that we tried to gather from our data was we coded as much as we could, we coded the prior affiliations of ISK's leadership tiers. We found at least 10 different groups which ISK seemed to recruit from for its leadership, right? So not surprising, it includes Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, the IMU, the Pakistani Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, right, and the Haqqani network. So what this really shows is that along with ISK's network, which allowed it to build this capacity, ISK's ability to recruit from all these different organizations, which have really, really experienced militants who have survived in the region, right, for years, has really allowed it to sustain itself, even in the face of these CT operations. And finally, we were able to code the nationalities of some of these leaders, only in about 20% of the cases, right? So you can imagine that the nationality was only reported in cases where newspapers deemed a person to be a foreigner. So unsurprisingly, the orange bar tells you that in Pakistan, foreigners were primarily Afghans, although we see more variety in Afghanistan, right? But what is really striking is ISK is really relying on Pakistani militants to recruit into its leadership ranks. Okay, just want to show you one final graph, and I'll skip a few slides to get to the end so we have time for Q&A. What have these CT operations meant for ISK's operational activity? I know there's a lot going on here, but I want to draw your attention to the yellow line, which shows the total number of attacks by ISK. The red line shows you ISK losses, right? So you can see that ISK losses seem to have impacted ISK's attacks because they are on the decline after 2017. But what you see in comparison in terms of the green line, which is ISK's lethality per attack, it increases drastically after 2017, right? So again, these are trends which we are seeing in 2019 and 2020 as well. I will skip that one. Okay, so going forward, what can we expect? What are the factors which will impact ISK's future trajectory? Obviously, the security environment, right? As I mentioned, Afghanistan's security apparatus. Also, ISK's ability to regain control of territory and intimidate civilian populations and control them. The last thing I want to highlight is just knowing that ISK has so many operational links with other groups. Is simply targeting ISK the solution? Probably not, because it exists as a network. And I think a holistic approach not only requires regional cooperation, but also dismantling the network. Otherwise, it's likely to survive even as a weakened organization.